Tonight, we're diving into one of the most misunderstood incidents in Pokémon history, the infamous Porygon episode that supposedly gave hundreds of children seizures in Japan. But as we'll discover, the real story is far more fascinating and reveals how media panic can become more dangerous than the original incident itself. Picture Japan in late 1997. Pokémon had been airing for nearly a year, captivating children across the country every Tuesday evening at 6:30 p.m. The show aired on TV Tokyo and its affiliated stations, reaching millions of households. December 16th seemed like any other Tuesday. Parents were preparing dinner, children were finishing homework, and at precisely 6:30 p.m., the familiar Pokémon theme music began playing across Japan. The episode that night was called Den-no Senshi Porygon, Computer Warrior Porygon in English, though it's more commonly referred to as Electric Soldier Porygon. It was the 38th episode of the series, written by Junkei Takagami and directed by Kiyotaka Itani. The plot was straightforward enough. Ash and his friends discover something wrong with the Pokeball transmitting device at their local Pokécenter. To investigate, they must journey inside the machine itself, entering a digital world where they encounter Porygon, a computer-generated Pokémon. The episode featured typical Pokémon adventure elements. Team Rocket had devised another scheme, this time involving a computer virus to disrupt the Pokémon transport system. Our heroes, accompanied by a prototype Porygon provided by a scientist named Dr. Akihabara, venture into cyberspace to stop them. It was whimsical, colorful, and entirely appropriate for children's television. For 20 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Children across Japan watched as Ash, Misty, and Brock navigated the digital landscape. The animation was typical of late 1990s anime. Bright, energetic, with the occasional flash effect to emphasize dramatic moments. Parents continued their evening routines, perhaps glancing occasionally at the screen, where their children sat mesmerized by the adventures of their favorite characters. Then, at exactly 6:51 p.m. and 34 seconds, something unprecedented happened. Deep in the episode's climax, our heroes find themselves under attack by what the story calls vaccine missiles, antiviral programs designed to eliminate the Team Rocket virus. As these digital projectiles streak toward them, Pikachu responds with his signature Thunderbolt attack. The missiles explode in a brilliant burst of light. To represent this digital explosion, the animators employed a technique called Paka Paka, rapidly alternating colors flashing on screen. For approximately 6 seconds, intense red and blue lights strobed at a rate of about 12 flashes per second. The effect filled a significant portion of the screen, creating what was intended to be a dazzling representation of a cyberspace explosion. Within minutes, something extraordinary began happening across Japan. Emergency phone lines started ringing. Parents were calling for ambulances. Children were reporting headaches, nausea, dizziness, and blurred vision. Some were experiencing more severe symptoms, convulsions, loss of consciousness, and what appeared to be epileptic seizures. By 7:30 p.m., just over half an hour after the episode aired, hospitals across Japan had admitted between 600 and 700 children with various symptoms. The media response was immediate and dramatic. Japanese news outlets began reporting what they termed Pokémon Shock, an unprecedented incident where a television show had apparently caused mass illness among children. The story dominated headlines, and by the next morning, it had become international news. But here's where the story becomes far more complex than anyone initially realized. To understand the true scope of the Pokémon incident, we need to examine the numbers carefully, because they tell a very different story than the panic-stricken headlines suggested. According to Japan's Fire and Disaster Management Agency, 685 viewers were taken to the hospitals by ambulance on the evening of December 16th, 310 males and 375 females. Of these, 208 were actually admitted to hospitals for observation. Only 2 people remained hospitalized for more than 2 weeks. The majority of those affected were between 11 and 15 years old, with over 90% falling within the middle and high school age ranges. The oldest victim was a 58-year-old from Kanagawa Prefecture. These numbers, while significant, represent the immediate response on December 16th. But what happened next reveals the true scope of what became known as the Pokémon Shock. In the days following the incident, as news reports dominated Japanese media, something remarkable occurred. The number of children reporting symptoms skyrocketed. By December 18th, 2 days after the original broadcast, approximately 12,000 additional children had reported feeling ill after allegedly watching the Pokémon episode. This represented a nearly 20-fold increase in reported cases. This dramatic surge caught the attention of researchers, particularly Benjamin Radford, a scientific paranormal investigator, and Robert Bartholomew, a sociologist. In 2001, they published a groundbreaking study in the Southern Medical Journal that challenged the conventional narrative about the Pokémon incident. Radford and Bartholomew's investigation uncovered a crucial detail that had been largely overlooked in the initial panic. The timeline of reported illness didn't match the timeline of the broadcast. While approximately 685 children were genuinely affected on the evening of December 16th, many of the additional 12,000 cases reported in subsequent days came from children who claimed to have watched the episode after learning about the incident through news reports and playground conversations. Quote, "The next day, I found news reports talking about how the Pokémon attacks were the talk of the schoolyard," Radford explained in later interviews. There were about 600 kids who genuinely did have headaches and convulsions and breathing problems. And it wasn't until 2 days later, when everyone's hearing about it, everybody in the schoolyard is talking about it. That was the key, because that provided the opportunity for the contagion." End quote. The researchers discovered that many children who reported symptoms had no identifiable organic basis for their illness. Beyond the verified cases of photosensitive epilepsy, which affected only a tiny fraction of those claiming to be affected, the symptoms reported were minor and short-lived. The pattern was consistent with mass psychogenic illness, commonly known as mass hysteria. Mass hysteria is a well-documented psychological phenomenon where physical symptoms spread through a group of people despite having no identifiable physical cause. It's not that the affected individuals are faking their symptoms. The symptoms are real and can be quite distressing. Rather, the symptoms are psychologically induced, often triggered by anxiety, stress, or suggestion. The Pokémon incident displayed classic characteristics of mass hysteria. The affected population was almost exclusively school-aged children who are particularly susceptible to suggestion and peer influence. The symptoms reported, headaches, nausea, dizziness, are commonly associated with anxiety and stress responses. Most tellingly, the dramatic increase in cases occurred after extensive media coverage had planted the idea that watching Pokémon could make children sick. Radford and Bartholomew's study revealed that the media coverage itself became a vector for the illness. News broadcasts about the incident sometimes replayed the problematic flashing sequence, causing additional children to experience symptoms while watching the news. This created a feedback loop where reporting on the incident actually perpetuated and amplified it. The researchers noted that later studies of the affected children supported their conclusions. A follow-up study tracking 103 patients over 3 years found that only 22% were reported to have had seizures after the initial incident, suggesting that most of the original cases were not true epileptic episodes. This isn't to say that the original flashing sequence posed no risk. Photosensitive epilepsy is a real condition affecting approximately 1 in 4,000 to 1 in 5,000 people. The rapid alternating red and blue flashes at 12 Hz were indeed capable of triggering seizures in susceptible individuals. Animation guidelines now specifically prohibit such effects, limiting flashing to no more than 3 times per second and avoiding isolated red flashes altogether. However, the scale of the reported impact was vastly disproportionate to the actual medical risk. Even accounting for Pokémon's massive viewership, estimated at over 4 million children that evening, the number of genuine photosensitive epilepsy cases should have been in the dozens, not the hundreds, and certainly not the thousands ultimately reported. The distinction is crucial because it highlights how a relatively minor medical incident was transformed by media coverage and social panic into a cultural phenomenon that dwarfed the original problem. The fear of Pokémon became more widespread and arguably more damaging than the actual medical effects of the episode. One of the most tragic aspects of the Pokémon Shock is how it affected the digital Pokémon at the center of the episode. Despite being entirely uninvolved in the problematic scene, it was Pikachu's Thunderbolt attack that created the seizure-inducing flashes. Porygon became the scapegoat for the entire incident. Following the controversy, Porygon was effectively banned from the Pokémon anime. The Pokémon has never had a starring role in any subsequent episode, despite continuing to appear in the games and receiving 2 evolutionary forms, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z. This banishment was so complete that it became part of Pokémon folklore, with fans regularly noting the irony that Pikachu, the actual cause of the problematic animation, remained the franchise's beloved mascot. In September 2020, the official Pokémon Twitter account briefly acknowledged this injustice, posting, "Porygon did nothing wrong," before quickly deleting the tweet, apparently considering the topic too sensitive even decades later. While Japan grappled with medical concerns and mass hysteria, the Pokémon phenomenon was facing an entirely different kind of panic in the United States. Religious opposition from evangelical Christians who saw something far more sinister than flashing lights in the colorful world of pocket monsters. The Pokémon controversy in America had been brewing since the franchise's arrival in 1998, but the seizure incident in Japan provided additional ammunition for religious critics who argued that Pokémon was spiritually dangerous. Leading this charge was Pastor Phil Arms of Life Reach Ministries in Richmond, Texas, whose warnings about Pokémon would become emblematic of the broader evangelical response to the franchise. In 2000, Arms published Pokémon and Harry Potter, A Fatal Attraction, a book that presented a comprehensive case against both franchises from a fundamentalist Christian perspective. Arms argued that Pokémon was not merely innocent entertainment, but rather a sophisticated form of occult indoctrination disguised as children's media. Quote, "Violence, psychic manipulation, witchcraft, murder, demons, wizards, magic, Satanism, and the occult are but a few of the featured attractions in the world of the ever-popular Pokémon phenomena," Arms wrote, describing his work as a stunning expose that penetrates the clever satanic camouflage which attempts to conceal the true diabolic nature of today's most popular children's literature and games. End quote. Arm's sermons, which later gained renewed attention through viral social media videos, claimed that Pokémon taught children how to enter into the world of witchcraft and opens a world of the demonic, of the satanic. He argued that the games were designed to familiarize children with summoning supernatural entities, drawing parallels between Pokémon and demons described in occult texts like the Lesser Key of Solomon. Arm's critique of Pokémon was part of a broader phenomenon known as the Satanic Panic, a moral panic that had swept through evangelical communities since the 1980s, targeting various forms of popular entertainment as gateways to occult practices. Prior to Pokémon, similar campaigns had been waged against Dungeons and Dragons, heavy metal music, and even certain children's toys. The allegations against Pokémon followed a familiar pattern. Critics pointed to the franchise's Japanese origins, noting its incorporation of elements from Eastern spirituality and folklore that differed from Christian theology. They focused on Pokémon's supernatural abilities, the creature's capacity to manipulate fire, water, electricity, and other natural forces, as evidence of occult themes. Particular attention was paid to certain Pokémon that critics viewed as obviously demonic. Ekans, whose name spelled snake backwards, was condemned as a reference to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Dragon-type Pokémon like Charizard and Dragonite were seen as representing the dragon imagery associated with Satan in Christian apocalyptic literature. Psychic-type Pokémon were viewed as promoting belief in telepathy and other paranormal abilities condemned in biblical passages about witchcraft. Some critics went further, claiming to find hidden satanic messages in the franchise. Unsubstantiated rumors circulated that playing certain Pokémon audio backwards would reveal demonic chants or anti-Christian messages. The close friendship between male characters Ash and Brock was interpreted by some as evidence of a gay agenda in children's programming. The evangelical opposition to Pokémon reached such intensity that some critics began circulating fabricated evidence to support their claims. In 2012, a gaming website called Play for Real published what purported to be a 1999 Time magazine interview with Pokémon creator Satoshi Tajiri. In this fictional interview, Tajiri allegedly admitted that Pokémon was created, quote, as a backlash against his Christian parents, and was deliberately designed to promote anti-Christian sentiment or Satanism, end quote. The fake Tajiri quotes were explosive. Quote, Pokémon is essentially the correct answer toward life, not Christianity. Everything presented in the game is the opposite of what Christians may believe. Some have said that the game promotes voodoo or magic, and I agree. I suppose some could say that the game supports Satanism, end quote. Despite being completely fabricated, these quotes spread rapidly through evangelical communities and Christian websites, often presented as authentic evidence of Pokémon's malevolent origins. The false interview was so convincing that it continued to circulate for years, with many Christians unaware that they were sharing completely fictitious content. The prevalence of this fabricated interview highlights the intensity of the religious opposition to Pokémon and the willingness of some critics to accept any evidence that confirmed their suspicions about the franchise, regardless of its authenticity. It also demonstrates how false information can become embedded in cultural narratives and persist long after being debunked. The evangelical campaign against Pokémon had real-world consequences in many Christian communities. Some Christian schools banned Pokémon cards, games, and merchandise from their premises. Children found with Pokémon items might have them confiscated and destroyed, often in dramatic fashion, intended to demonstrate the spiritual danger they supposedly represented. Former students of evangelical schools from this era recall teachers and administrators who would tear Pokemon trading cards in half when discovered, sometimes conducting impromptu lessons about the spiritual dangers hidden in popular entertainment. Some children reported having their Pokemon collections thrown away by parents who had been convinced by sermons or books like ARMS that the franchise posed a genuine threat to their spiritual development. Church youth groups sometimes organized events where children were encouraged to bring Pokemon items to be destroyed, framed as acts of spiritual liberation similar to the book burning described in Acts 19. These events were often accompanied by testimonials from children who claimed to feel spiritually freed after giving up Pokemon. The intensity of this response varied significantly between different Christian communities and denominations. While some evangelical leaders led crusades against Pokemon, others viewed such campaigns as misguided overreactions that damaged the church's credibility and ability to engage with popular culture constructively. Notably, not all Christian authorities shared the evangelical panic about Pokemon. In 2000, the Vatican conducted its own investigation into the franchise and concluded that Pokemon games contained, quote, no harmful moral side effects. This official Catholic position provided a stark contrast to the fevered opposition coming from some Protestant quarters. The Vatican's assessment was based on a more nuanced understanding of fantasy entertainment and its relationship to religious faith. Catholic theologians recognized that fictional worlds with supernatural elements were not inherently incompatible with Christian belief, particularly when those elements were clearly presented as fantasy rather than alternative religious systems. This measured response from the world's largest Christian denomination undermined some of the more extreme claims about Pokemon's supposed spiritual dangers and highlighted the degree to which the evangelical opposition was driven by cultural and theological assumptions specific to certain Protestant traditions. The Pokemon panic among evangelicals occurred during a period of intense cultural warfare in American Christianity, particularly around issues of popular entertainment and its influence on children. The 1990s had seen similar controversies over music, movies, and television shows, with religious conservatives arguing that secular media was deliberately undermining Christian values and corrupting young minds. This cultural moment was characterized by a fortress mentality in many evangelical communities, where engagement with mainstream culture was viewed with deep suspicion. Popular entertainment was often not seen as morally neutral content that might contain both positive and negative elements, but as part of a coordinated assault on Christian civilization. The Pokemon controversy also reflected broader anxieties about globalization and culture change. The franchise's Japanese origins made it an easy target for concerns about foreign influences on American children, while its massive commercial success represented the growing power of international media corporations to shape youth culture. The evangelical campaign against Pokemon had lasting effects on how the franchise was perceived in certain Christian communities. Even decades later, some parents who grew up during the Pokemon panic remain suspicious of the franchise, sometimes passing those concerns on to their own children, despite the lack of substantive evidence for the original claims. The controversy also contributed to a broader pattern of Christian disengagement from popular culture that many contemporary Christian leaders now view as counterproductive. Rather than developing thoughtful frameworks for engaging with secular entertainment, the reflexive opposition to franchises like Pokémon left many Christians unprepared to help their children navigate an increasingly complex media landscape. Some Christian apologists and cultural critics have argued that the Pokémon panic represents a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing fear and misinformation to drive religious responses to popular culture. They contend that such campaigns ultimately damage the church's credibility and ability to offer meaningful guidance on genuine moral and spiritual issues. Perhaps the greatest irony of the evangelical opposition to Pokémon is its selective application of concerns about fantasy content. Many of the same communities that condemned Pokémon for featuring supernatural creatures and magical abilities enthusiastically embraced works like C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia and J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which contain similar elements presented in explicitly Christian or Christian-compatible frameworks. The inconsistency highlighted the degree to which cultural and theological prejudices, rather than consistent principles about fantasy content, drove much of the opposition to Pokémon. The franchise's Japanese origins and association with contemporary youth culture made it suspect in ways that established works of Christian fantasy literature were not. The Pokémon Shock incident and its aftermath had profound effects on animation standards worldwide. The episode has never been broadcast again anywhere in the world, even in edited form. Japan implemented strict guidelines for animated content, including warnings about viewing distance and room lighting that still appear on anime today. These guidelines, developed in response to the incident, specify that flashing effects cannot exceed 3 per second and cannot use isolated red flashes, which are particularly problematic for photosensitive individuals. The regulations also require broadcasters to include warnings about photosensitive epilepsy at the beginning of programs that might contain flashing effects. The incident influenced international broadcasting standards as well. Many countries reviewed their own guidelines for children's programming and implemented similar restrictions on flashing effects, even though the original incident had occurred only in Japan. The immediate economic consequences of Pokémon Shock were severe. Nintendo's stock price dropped by 3.2% the day after the incident, losing 400 yen per share as investors worried about the long-term damage to the Pokémon brand. Video rental stores across Japan pulled Pokémon content from their shelves, and toy retailers reported significant drops in Pokémon merchandise sales. However, these economic effects proved temporary. Pokémon's popularity recovered remarkably well, and the franchise went on to become one of the most successful entertainment properties in history. The incident, rather than destroying Pokémon, became part of its cultural mythology and may have even contributed to its international notoriety. The rapid recovery demonstrated the resilience of popular entertainment properties and the limited long-term impact of moral panics on commercial success. Despite intense criticism from religious groups and the trauma of the seizure incident, Pokémon's core appeal to children and its fundamental entertainment value proved more powerful than the controversies surrounding it. The Pokémon Shock incident offers valuable lessons about media literacy and critical thinking in the information age. The transformation of a relatively minor medical incident into a massive cultural panic demonstrates how quickly misinformation can spread and how difficult it can be to correct false narratives once they become established. The role of media coverage in amplifying the original incident cannot be understated. By repeatedly showing the problematic flashing sequence and focusing on the most dramatic aspects of the story, news outlets inadvertently contributed to the mass hysteria they were reporting on. This feedback loop between media coverage and public panic has been observed in numerous other contexts and represents an ongoing challenge for responsible journalism. The evangelical response to Pokémon, particularly the circulation of fabricated evidence like the fake Tajiri interview, highlights the importance of source verification and fact-checking, especially when information confirms pre-existing beliefs or biases. The persistence of debunked claims in certain communities demonstrates how difficult it can be to correct misinformation once it becomes embedded in cultural narratives. Benjamin Radford and Robert Bartholomew's research on the Pokémon incident has become a landmark study in the field of mass psychogenic illness. Their work demonstrated the importance of careful epidemiological investigation in distinguishing between genuine medical events and psychologically induced phenomena. The study's been cited in numerous subsequent investigations of mass hysteria outbreaks, providing a methodological framework for researchers examining similar incidents. It's also contributed to broader understanding of how media coverage can influence the spread of psychogenic illness and the importance of responsible reporting on medical incidents. The Pokémon research has practical implications for public health officials and emergency responders dealing with potential mass hysteria incidents. The study emphasizes the need to consider psychological factors alongside medical ones when investigating outbreaks of unexplained illness, particularly when they involve children and adolescents. The Pokémon Shock incident occurred during a unique moment in technological and cultural history. The late 1990s represented the height of broadcast television's cultural influence, when a single program could simultaneously reach millions of viewers in a way that is increasingly difficult in today's fragmented media landscape. The incident also predated the rise of social media, which might have either amplified the panic further or provided platforms for more rapid fact-checking and debunking of false claims. The role of playground conversations and traditional news media in spreading the hysteria offers insight into how information traveled in pre-internet popular culture. The controversy surrounding Pokémon in religious communities similarly reflects a specific historical moment when evangelical Christianity was particularly concerned about popular culture's influence on children. Contemporary Christian communities have generally developed more sophisticated approaches to engaging with secular entertainment, though concerns about media influence on children persist. The banishment of Porygon from the Pokémon anime remains one of the most enduring consequences of the 1997 incident. Despite having no responsibility for the problematic flashing effects, which were caused by Pikachu's attack, not Porygon's presence, the digital Pokémon became permanently associated with the controversy. This guilt by association represents a form of cultural scapegoating that has had lasting effects on the Pokémon narrative universe. Porygon's absence from the anime has deprived storytellers of opportunities to explore themes related to digital technology and virtual reality that might have been particularly relevant as those technologies became more prominent in real life. The irony of Pikachu's continued popularity, despite being the actual cause of the problematic animation, highlights how cultural narratives can become detached from factual causation. The franchise's decision to protect its mascot at the expense of a less popular character demonstrates the commercial considerations that often drive cultural responses to controversy. The Pokémon Shock incident remains relevant to contemporary discussions about media effects, particularly as concerns about screen time and digital media influence on children continue to evolve. While the specific concern about flashing animations has been largely addressed through technical guidelines, broader questions about media consumption and its psychological effects persist. The incident also provides insights into how health scares can spread in the age of global media and social networks. The patterns of initial genuine cases followed by mass psychogenic illness have been observed in numerous subsequent incidents, involving everything from mysterious illnesses in schools to concern about technological health effects. The religious controversy surrounding Pokémon offers lessons for contemporary debates about popular culture and its relationship to religious values. The evolution of Christian responses to secular entertainment from outright opposition to more nuanced engagement reflects broader changes in how religious communities relate to mainstream culture. One of the most important aspects of the Pokémon Shock aftermath was the eventual intervention of qualified researchers who challenged the initial narrative. Radford and Bartholomew's willingness to investigate the incident years later and publish findings that contradicted popular understanding demonstrates the importance of expert analysis in correcting false cultural narratives. Their work also highlights the value of interdisciplinary approaches to understanding complex social phenomena. The Pokémon incident required insights from medicine, psychology, sociology, and media studies to fully understand, emphasizing how contemporary challenges often transcend traditional academic boundaries. The researchers' findings were not immediately widely accepted, and their work initially received less attention than the original panic. This pattern, where sensational initial reports receive more coverage than subsequent corrections, represents an ongoing challenge for science communication and public understanding. The true lesson of the Pokémon Shock may be that fear itself can be more contagious and damaging than the dangers we fear. A medical incident affecting fewer than 700 children was transformed by media coverage and social panic into a cultural phenomenon affecting tens of thousands. Religious concerns about spiritual corruption led to the circulation of fabricated evidence and the destruction of children's belongings. A single anime episode ended the television career of an innocent digital creature. In each case, the response to Pokémon proved more significant than any actual harm caused by the franchise itself. The seizures experienced by photosensitive viewers were real and concerning, but the mass hysteria that followed affected far more people. The religious objections to Pokémon reflected genuine spiritual concerns, but the methods used to address those concerns often involved deception and cultural warfare that damaged the credibility of their proponents. The Pokémon Shock serves as a case study in how quickly misinformation can spread, how persistent false narratives can become, and how easily fear can override rational analysis. It demonstrates the importance of careful investigation, responsible media coverage, and skeptical thinking in the face of moral panics and health scares. Perhaps most importantly, the incident reveals how cultural objects, whether Pokémon cards, anime episodes, or children's games, can become symbols onto which we project our broader anxieties about technology, cultural change, and moral decline. The real battle was never about Pokémon itself, but about deeper questions of cultural authority, generational change, and the pace of globalization in the late 20th century. As we continue to grapple with concerns about technology's impact on children, the influence of global media corporations, and the relationship between popular entertainment and traditional values, the Pokémon Shock offers both cautionary lessons and reasons for optimism. It reminds us of the dangers of moral panic, while also demonstrating that even the most intense cultural controversies can eventually be resolved through careful investigation, good humor, and the simple passage of time. The children who grew up playing Pokemon despite the warnings of seizures and spiritual corruption have largely turned out fine, and many are now parents themselves, navigating similar questions about their own children's media consumption. The Pokemon franchise continues to thrive, bringing joy to new generations, while serving as a reminder that sometimes our fears say more about us than they do about the things we're afraid of. In the end, Pokemon Shock may be remembered not as the time a cartoon nearly destroyed a generation, but as the time we learned something important about the power of fear, the importance of facts, and the remarkable resilience of both children and the popular culture they love. And somewhere in the digital realm, Porygon continues to wait patiently for its eventual redemption. Proof that even in our darkest cultural panics, innocence can endure. Thanks for listening.